Process of going live, so I'll tell you when we're up. Okay, it looks like we're live. This is the Salem Center's election discussion group, our first post-election discussion and probably our last post-election discussion of the recent election. And this is from the Salem Center in the McCombs School of Business at the University of Texas, Austin. So we had a number of sessions where we talked about our hopes, fears, thoughts about the two candidates and what's been going on with the election. Today, I'd like to talk first about what we make of the outcome of the election and whether it's certain or to what extent in doubt, and then thoughts about what's going to happen going forward, our hopes and fears about a Biden administration. So I just want to first throw it out to both of you, Chris and Carlos. What's our state of knowledge with respect to the election? Is there much doubt in your view?
No, not in my view. I think this is I would hope that maybe what can come out of this in some ways in terms of the messiness associated with the voting is that there's some sort of a bipartisan efforts to just clean up a little bit on the rules. And again, I understand there's different states are in charge of it, and that complicates things a bit. And I like the fact that different states are in charge of it. But at the same time, I think we're just, some states were not really all that ready for the onslaught of mail-in ballots in a way that just creates the possibility not only of fraud but of people claiming fraud, and it just makes the whole thing more uncomfortable than it should be. And I don't have enough information to understand whether there's any specific concern in some places, but it wouldn't surprise me if there's some sort of degree of miscounting. But again, I don't think there's any doubt given what has to have happened systematically across multiple states for it to change the outcome. So I don't think the outcome is any doubt, in my view.
Chris, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, similarly, I don't think that the outcome, there's any doubt about the outcome. And I read, I think not too long before we hopped on this, that the last of kind of the Trump campaign's lawsuits had been dismissed. And so I think they might be out of kind of legal firepower. I think the only question now is what's the friction going to look like between now and January 20th, since President Trump has, as of yet, not conceded and has not allowed his administration to start the transition in earnest and start giving briefings and things like that to the Biden administration. I think the only kind of other thing that I've seen some rumblings of on social media is there's a certain faction of, I think, the Trump campaign / base that's advocating for state legislatures to send electors that don't actually reflect kind of the results of the popular vote. And so I think the odds of that are slim, but they're not zero. And so I think that would create an interesting constitutional crisis. But I think ultimately at noon on January 20th, we will hopefully see a peaceful transition of power.
Yeah, my sense is similar. I think the one could quibble about this or that news agency which called it a day earlier or a half hour later or whatever. But the idea of the news agencies are calling it in some way that's unusual or misguided or wrong, I think is strange. They've always made these calls when the numbers came in as best they could. And I think we're seeing what's happened in pretty much every previous year. And the call for Biden seems to me as good as any of the other recent calls. The only difference is that there are all these mail-in ballots. That's confusing. The states were caught off guard. Of course, states were trying to make changes to facilitate that at the last minute. But of course, there were concerns about making changes at the last minute, and there was litigation about that. And I agree with Carlos. Hopefully, having seen this, hopefully several years before the next election, we can get states thinking about how can we fortify our systems, how can we, make it such that we get results earlier and more seamlessly. And I think there's just been a lot of, not very credible claims of fraud, and small scale fraud there must always be, and I'm sure some will be found if people look close enough. But I think it's there's no real reason to think there's anything major and systematic, and I don't think attempts to persuade people will be effective enough to affect the transition. So we can talk about the policy and what Trump and some of the Republicans are doing, and should they be doing that, which is, I think, a good question. But it's along the lines of other questions we've asked about the character of the president and the nature of the administration, and how one judges that and how one weighs it relative to other factors. I think probably a better use of our time to talk about what we're expecting from a Biden administration and hopes and fears with respect to it.
So I think I'll start, given that I'll be leaving a little early today. First, I want to thank you, Greg, and Chris, and all the other students that are not here today but didn't show up and participate in this. I think it was a very useful set of conversations that we had throughout the election. And I actually come out of this election feeling very positive in the way I think people voted. I think that the way I like to read the results, and maybe I'm very optimistic here, is that there was clearly a rejection of Trump's character, and at the same time, a big rejection of leftist policies. And if I choose to read the results that way, I think that's very encouraging to me. So, I as somebody that went out that day and voted, not that day, I voted earlier, that voted for Trump, I can say that I was not voting for the individual. I was voting for what the individual represented in terms of the policies that I mean, we talked about this. Right? There's a number of policies, a number of attitudes that individual, flawed as it may be, was a close representation of that bundle that I was voting for. And I think that bundle, to some extent, got a lot of support in the country, if not for the votes for Trump. So, you're going to have a House with the lowest margin since 1919. You're going to have a Senate that's best case scenario for Democrats at 50-50, which tells that the country is not at all ready for the sort of absolutely crazy lefty agenda that they've been running on. Wokeism, I think, lost big in this election. The idea of a Green New Deal, the idea of back in the courts, the idea of even though you use the word socialism, that's something that a lot of Democrats are running, saying, "Listen, this hurts us a lot in our districts," right? So it's I think a big win in my view. So as far as what I hope, I think what I'm hoping now is for basically gridlock, nothing. I hope for nothing to get done. And that's the typical thing that I kind of generally like. I like the government passing fewer laws. The only thing that I worry about it in that process is that we've seen already through the years, this sort of like norm of presidents using executive action in annoying ways. We saw that in maybe national security issues with George Bush. We saw that a lot under Obama. After he lost Congress in 2010, we saw that quite a bit with Trump, and I don't expect much of a difference with Biden. I think Biden's going to try to stretch that to appease his base, in particular the loud base that is going to be like very upset with gridlock. So that's my only concern. But I don't think there's a very consequential things that Biden can do. There's some consequential things on the margin, like things with the EPA and I already saw two things that worry me a lot, and I don't think it's a big issue, but something that worries me because I live at universities, like they're trying to go back, the sort of roll back what Beth DeVos had undone some ways the sort of due process for students on campus being accused of sexual misconduct, for example. I think it was a very bad policy that they try to force universities to do through the powers of grants that they have. Don't like that. They're going to unroll the whole critical race theory training as well. I think it's a really bad thing. But you expect those things, but I don't think they're generally very consequential. So, yeah, I'm hoping for a middle of the road next 2 years. I think the market sort of like feel the same way as me in some capacity, and hopefully some motivation for a few bipartisan things that might actually take place. Because they're gonna have to run on something in 2 years, so maybe there's some room for some action. Let's see, the things that I was thinking that might be useful is that maybe there's some cleaning up of health systems that might take a bipartisan take. Perhaps some things on public health that you can think that there's an opportunity to like, hey, we learned quite a bit about not being ready. So maybe there's federally supported systems that can be put in place for the future. But I don't know, beyond that, I don't think there's much room for any bill that I can see coming up.
I'm in a pretty similar place on this. As in this election, a Biden voter, but also not an enthusiastic one. So I, in addition, I was hoping for a much bigger Trump loss than we had, but I was fearful that that would come with Democratic control of the Senate, and enough Democratic control of the Senate that they could do, quite a lot. And I was worried about what they would do. I'm heartened that we're going to have a split Senate and more either a Republican-controlled Senate or a one that's so close that the Democrats can't have one defection from their party. That makes me think we're going to have gridlock government and not a lot done, which I think is mostly for the good. I was hoping for a bigger Trump defeat because, I mean, one, I think his character is a moral character, I think is a problem, and we want to distance from that. But also, I think his policies, insofar as they differ from the Republican policies prior to him, often differ in a bad direction. And so to my liking, a bad direction. So I was hoping for more reconsideration within the Republican Party of if, it seems like everyone thinks this guy's now a loser, maybe we'll get a party which had policies more like it did before. I think that's now very unlikely. So I don't think there's going to be much pushback against his position on trade, for example, which I think is one of his worst elements, if you're not judging him as a character, but judging his policy planks. I'd like to see more of a return to the Bush, Clinton, Obama era views of trade. But I do think, so I think the effects in the Republican Party won't be what I hoped for from a bigger defeat. But yeah, I think we'll probably be in a period of not very aggressive government. I think that is not many changes, not much legislation. I am worried about a lot of executive orders for the same reason, Carlos, you are. And Biden is just positionally, he claims he wants to try to turn the temperature down. He wants to try to reach out across the aisle. Probably at first he'll try to do that, and so fewer executive orders the first week or so, but except for direct undoings of things. But I don't know how long we could expect that to last. I'd love to see a period where not much big gets done because the Congress is divided, but smaller things get done. And I would hope that there could be consensus on, although I don't think it's too likely, on kind of things that would actually rein in the executive branch. I mean, we've had a Republican president that the Democrats thought was a horror, preceded by a Democratic president who the Republicans were really upset by his overreach with executive orders, preceded by a Republican president. So you'd think if they could get together on anything in a period where you have a candidate who says, I want to reconcile things and whatever, it would be maybe let's, take away some of the power to do so many things through executive order. I'd love it if that happened. I don't think it will, but that's my best case scenario. And the worst case scenario, I think that's likely, is that just not that much gets done. Some things I don't like. I agree that the DeVos changes on a number of things I think were among the better things that happened in the Trump administration, and I'm sad to see some of those go. I think we'll see some other, in terms of who's in the administration and the regulatory positions, things I'm not too happy about, but I don't think major sea changes. Chris, what's your take?
Yeah, I think very similar to both of you, with a slight nuance, is I think there will be a whole lot of nothing getting done, and I think that will be almost refreshing for a change. I think what I would like to see come out of it is, this might be a little bit too aspirational, but a little bit more unity and working together and reaching across the aisle to get things done. I would love to see a return to that instead of this kind of winner take all, and if not, I'm going to take my ball and go home type of mentality. And that's on both sides, right? I think both sides of the aisle are guilty of that. And so I'd like to see a little bit more of that and compromise to get things done. As someone who generally is probably slightly right of center, I think it's important to, in general, maintain the status quo. And if there are more progressive policies, they should be well thought out, and you should have to fight hard to change things, because once you change things, it's very hard to revert back. And so, yeah, I would like to see a little bit more unity and kind of cooperation among the branches of government. I think one of the things that the Trump administration has shown is not necessarily a weakness in our democratic system, but maybe a little bit of a chink in the armor, is presidents who don't kind of observe the norms of the branch and try and install loyalists instead of good civil servants. I think that can be a very dangerous weapon, and could, without very dedicated civil servants, lead to something resembling a autocracy or something like that. And so I think that that's something that would hopefully be addressed, because I think now that again that particular can of worms is opened, I think there's danger that it's going to continue, and all of a sudden the norms of the office are going to change, and the norms of the branch. And so I think my biggest concern out of the transition, but not even related to the transition, just kind of one of the remnants of the Trump administration.
Yeah, I mean, a hope in that connection is that some of those norms can be codified into law in some way, so that we're not at the mercy of which guy gets elected, because it's not only Republicans that you're going to see people who want to violate these norms. Now, once a norm's eroded, it's eroded by everyone. And so maybe we could get both parties agreeing to shore some of them up in statute.
So let me just make a couple of comments before I jump out. So when you mentioned about the lack of a resounding loss for Trump in particular, and I will agree with you. Not necessarily that's a bad thing, but I think there's a clear characterization that I don't think this election is an election that the Mitt Romneys of the world are the ones that are going to come out powerful. I think that we're talking about here. I think one way to read what happened is that the Republican Party becomes the party of working class people, and the Democrats becomes the party of the coastal elites and minorities, in particular one minority, right? Even though they got eroded, there's support there, but it's still overwhelming. African American minorities, overwhelming Democrats. So if you look at that, it becomes like, well, listen, there's a whole chunk of people in the middle, right? That they don't necessarily see the steps of the positive things that come from free trade or free immigration or so on. So I think the Republican Party is going to become this less influenced by their Wall Street sort of support, chamber of commerce type people, more like a populist right type thing. Hopefully they can clear out the elements that might put them in this danger of being called racist or whatever, right? Just so that if you want to be a party of the working class in those terms, in populistic terms, so be it. I don't think it's great for the long run, because I don't think either party is going to be clearly advocating for free trade or free immigration or just like getting government out of the way, right? There'll be sort of this sclerotic thing going on the right. But maybe there's some good leaders that can take advantage of this in a way that is not so bad, right? So maybe there's some hope in Marco Rubio's of the world, or like Ron DeSantis in Florida. There's some Nikki Haley. Even if she can be smart about this, she can be quite powerful as a person running later on. And the second comment I was going to make is to do with the gridlock. And from a partisan perspective, I almost wonder, which one do you think is best? Is it best for us to get to a 50-50 Chuck Schumer situation where, or 51-49 with a majority leader being McConnell? I almost feel like it's better to have a Chuck Schumer, so then you can not blame the Republicans for anything, but nothing will get done anyway. There'll be the gridlock. I think is essentially this. I don't think much changes. I think because you're going to have like Manchin and Tester be incredibly powerful on a 50-50 Senate, and not much will get done.
Yeah, I think what it amounts to is who is in charge of the Senate's agenda. but it's not going to change what bills get passed, basically.
Right.
Because
right.
you have, Collins and so forth. You have the kind of more moderate Republicans and you have the more moderate Democrats. And I think you're not going to get anything without them. So the question is, who do you want determining what bills get voted on? And I don't think that makes a giant difference, but just for a change of pace and not having the claim that the institution's obstructionist, there's a case for Schumer, but I'm not sure I prefer it. I think it's really six of one, half dozen of the other. On the changes in the society or what we're seeing about where the parties are. I mean, one thing that's hopeful and another thing that's not hopeful about it. One thing that's hopeful, in addition to there being a rejection of, wherever the Democrats got tied to socialism, they did really badly. And I think that's a good thing. And hopefully that will make them back off of that. Maybe it'll radicalize them and make them double down. But also I thought the fact that Trump did better with blacks and Hispanics than in previous elections, and quite well with Hispanics in some subsections, and that he did worse with, or ultimately Biden did better with white people, again, than he had both of them than they had in the past, right? I think that was kind of nice. It like tamped it down a little bit on the racialized thinking about the electorate, so it's a coalition of blacks versus whites and Hispanics go in between. The more it's, black people on both sides and Hispanic people on both sides, and the more I think that's a better situation.
Right.
So I was happy about that. What I'm unhappy with the Republican Party becoming more of a party of the working class is, the question of what will the Democrats become? The union of coastal elites and inner city and blacks in urban areas does not really make sense as a union. So I don't think that because of ideologically, the voters are actually more aligned with the Republicans usually. So I don't think that we'll see how long that can last as a thing, but I don't know that that's a coalition that can continue to exist. The Republican coalition, I thought for a long time, maybe couldn't continue to exist for that long. Business leaders and sort of rural voters, basically. It seems like they've gone more the rural voter route. I don't know. There's a question of where will business, what party will be the party that is aligned with business interests, and we'll see what happens with that. Neither party looks like too great a.
I can tell you that there's one party that at least doesn't seem to be okay with lock people down their homes, right? That's a big difference there. So it's an indication that regardless of the rhetoric, one party do trust businesses and feel that they are needed for society, and the other party says, business is a second thought. Yeah. So I think that's pretty clear.
But we'll see, because is that really about business, or is it about attitudes towards elites, or is it? We'll see as it develops. And
right.
What I worry about, though, and I've been worried about this for several years now, is it seems to me like we're becoming a lot more like Europe. And we're becoming a lot more like Europe in the way our parties are aligned. So that you have where you used to think of the Republican Party as a more free trade party, a more pro-business, pro-capitalist party, a more what they would call in Europe liberal party, which had conservative, nationalist, regionalist elements in it, to be sure, but that's not what you saw as central to the party. And then you saw the Democratic Party as the equivalent of the labor parties of Europe, but not quite so left as the labor parties of Europe. I worry that now the Democratic Party seems like it's looking more like Europe labor parties, and the Republican Party is looking more and more like a European right-wing party that's not really more pro-capitalist, but more pro-nationalist and pro-national identity issues. And that's a change that I'm sad about. I think it makes both parties worse, and hopefully there'll be a way to evolve into a more American-looking politics. But I'm not too optimistic about that.
So just a final thought for me is that I do think that there is a lot of figuring out to do by both parties in the next cycle. And I think that being in a situation where there's a bit of a stalemate there'll be a lot of entrepreneurship coming from either side, trying to figure out how to break the stalemate. And yeah, if you're right, that if if that entrepreneurship is extremist in each case, it's going to be probably not great in the next couple election cycles in terms of finding a path forward, right? But maybe I'm just like with everything that I am generally very hopeful in entrepreneurship, is that people have they find a way to be smart here and take advantage of a situation that's beneficial for them, and for us that might be actually something that gets us to a better place. So
yeah, I'm not so worried about the extremists versus the moderates as I am what's the leading ideas that some people are extreme or moderate about. And because if the leading idea was real freedom, I'd be all for being extreme about it. But if the leading idea is each nation keeps to itself and we don't have much trade and such, then moderation about that idea is better, but rejecting it altogether is best. And if each of the parties becomes, even if in a moderate way, about the ideas they have that I think is less good, that's worse than if each of them becomes, whether in a moderate or extreme way, more about the ideas I think that they're better on.
all right, I'm gonna have to sign off, guys. Thank you so
All
much again, and
Thanks for
I'll
being
talk
a
to you
part
soon.
of this.
Of course.
So Chris, what's your thinking about where we're headed, more in terms of how you imagine the parties evolving?
Yeah, so I think that we're probably in the middle of kind of another kind of party shift, like we saw, I think, in the early to mid part of the 20th century, right? Because to your point, I think we're sort of aligned along rural versus urban, but then also coastal versus Midwest. And I think one of the kind of postmortems that I read, I forget where, was that there are a lot of people in the middle states that are tired of being referred to by Democrats as, the flyover states and things like that. And I think that is partially evidenced in, there were a couple of Senate races that were thought to be maybe a little bit closer than they ended up being. The Texas Senate race with Cornyn and Hager is one example. It was the closest that a Democrat has come in 3 decades, but still was like not even really a contest. And along with that, I think that the results of it showed that there are a not insignificant number of traditionally Republican voters who said, okay, we're drawing a line in the sand at the presidential level. And that's why you saw, many instances where Biden won the presidency, but then kind of most of the down ballot was still Republican. And so I think we've shown that character matters in a president. And I think that both parties are going through, like you said, a lot of self-reflection, and are going to have to kind of figure out what's next for them. Because just based on kind of some of the commentary that I read, it comes from more of like the evangelical side. And I think Trump lost a lot of evangelical voters because of his character and because of some of his policies. And so I think that that's an area where there may have to be a little bit of cleanup in aisle 6 for the GOP. So it'll be interesting to see. I was really encouraged that there was such a big turnout. I think it shows that our government still matters by and large to the American people, and I hope that this is the lowest voter turnout that we see for the next 20 years. That would make me very happy. I like to vote as often as I can. So
only once an election,
though. That's right. Yes.
One of the things that the Trump presidency really made stark to me, and I hope it does to more people on both sides of the aisle, or as I am, I think of myself as on neither side of the aisle, is the extent to which we should be able to commonly value a lot of American institutions and procedures. So I normally don't like when people disdain partisanship and speak about, being non-polarized and etc. Because my view is if you have a belief that you hold to, you should really be strong in it. And I don't favor moderation in political matters. If by that you mean wishy-washy and often I think on the issues I think the Republicans are more right than the Democrats on. I think the Republicans need to go a lot further than they do. And on the issues where I think the Democrats are more right, I think they need to go a lot further than they do. And on most issues where I think neither of them are right, what I want to do is very far out of the mainstream. So it really bothered me, for example, when Obama was talking against Republican obstructionism, against people who are unwilling to rise above their own selfish or narrow interests and do what's best for the country. The problem, Barack, was people disagreed with you about what was best for the country. But there is a sense in which I think we should be able to, all or most of us, recognize certain things that are of value about the country that, as it is, that we have to value and come together to value despite our differences. Things like that there are smooth transitions of power, that the elections work in such a way that one could tell who won, that it's clear who has authority over things, and there are chains of command, that there are civil servants who survive one administration to the next and work to advance the administration's goals, but in ways that give you continuity and so forth. And there are concerns with all of these things. I mean, maybe the civil servants have too much of an institutional mindset and are inflexible enough. And, there are questions about how we can fix that and maybe make them more responsive. But I think we really have to think about that there's a value to having that kind of thing. And you should be able to say, I disagree with the other guy entirely about what immigration policy should be, but or about whether the corporate tax rate should be higher or lower, or even whether there should be Medicare or not, since no Republicans think we should get rid of it, but I do because I'm not a socialist like they are. But you should be able to disagree really emphatically, and of course, like the Democrats are too, with the other party on that and say, but whether or not we get rid of it or grow it, we ought to not be in a position where one or two people who happen to be in office for a few years can make outsized changes unilaterally. We want a more liberal immigration policy, but we don't want it to be done by executive order. And so we're worried about when Obama does it the way he did it. And there's a tendency to, if you have strong political beliefs and you associate the other party with opposition to them, think running roughshod over them is fine. And I think you should be able to say, it's not that I'm moderate on this, but it's that I recognize that there's a hierarchy of values here. And the value of having a political process by which things are determined in a slow and orderly and measured manner, and there aren't turns on a dime, is higher than getting the policy I think is right on this issue now. So I really hope people will come around to that, and there'll be laws and measures passed in the Senate and so forth to enforce that. But I'm not that optimistic it'll happen, I'm afraid.
Yeah, and I think you hit on something that I think is really key, is just the having some sort of a consistency or almost like a predictability, right? So like with immigration, right? It's, okay, are dreamers okay now? Well, great. How are they going to be in 4 years? And so not being able to have any kind of a consistency of policy is, I think, dangerous, because what then happens is we just start swinging back and forth, and a lot of the day-to-day lives of a vast number of people changes depending on kind of the political party that's in power, and not just in power, but who holds the White House, right? Yeah. If it's all done largely through executive orders.
And
so I think that's
scary,
key.
and it's bad for everyone to have that kind of uncertainty.
Right.
An uncertainty about the steps by which things can change. So I hope we'll see a growing consensus to that effect. I don't know, how optimistic are you that that'll happen, though?
Not very, because I think whoever's in power at the time doesn't want to give that away, especially as we've kind of seen the back and forth of, well, the last guy did it, so now I should have a turn to do it, and back and forth. And so,
Yeah, I mean,
in general, oh, sorry, go ahead.
you need an executive who really prioritized that in a fairly mixed Congress, right? So if that was really what Biden was all about, you'd think he could accomplish it. One, he could threaten to use the powers in the ways the other party didn't like and say, but what I'd really like is to get rid of this power. Like, if I know the next Republican president is going to do X, I'm going to have to do Y now. But if you'll get with me to do Z, then, I won't do Y and I'll know the next guy won't do X. If he was strong as a leader, could forge the relationships, and that was really his number one priority thing, I think you could imagine somebody who's elected as a moderate Democrat or Republican in a situation where the balance in both other houses is so close as accomplishing that. But I doubt Biden himself has the leadership abilities to do it. And I doubt that he's really that committed to that, although he's certainly more dispositionally in that direction than a lot of other people we have. So that's one reason I don't see it happening. And the other reason I worry it won't happen is I think if the I don't think that Biden's got either the character or skills to really make it happen on the one hand. And then on the other hand, if the Republicans did, I think the early signs we'd see of that is more of them distancing themselves more from Trump on the claims of election fraud and so forth, more of them saying, here and no further on a lot of points up till now. And they've consistently surprised me on their lack of backbone in the face of Trump. Now, maybe, they're afraid of his base and maybe that'll go away once he's out of office, but I don't think it will, because he'll still be in the world and making his claims. So both on the Republican side and the Democratic side, I'm not seeing the will to do it. And that frightens me, although I think a lot of people more and more may want it. And if we want it loudly enough, maybe that'll lead to politicians who want the strengthening of the institutions.
Yeah, and I think you're exactly right that I also have been disappointed with some of the Republican legislators who have not kind of distanced themselves. In particular, Cruz and then Lindsey Graham, and even Marco Rubio has kind of tossed out the election fraud thing. And I think you're exactly right. I think that they're largely playing to the base because they realize that the Trump base is, a new demographic that they have to work to court. And so, but you're also right that, Trump doesn't just vanish from the face of the earth. He still continues to exist even outside of the presidency.
And people who appeal to his rhetoric still exist. The people who that appeals to and other people who will try to drum it up still exist. So it's hard to see. I mean, I wrote a list of predictions of what I thought was going to happen, what I was hopeful and fearful about when Trump won, and I voted against him last time. And I looked back over it, and it was pretty accurate, I have to say, about what the last 4 years have been like. But if I think about what I wrote there and also what else I was thinking, the Republican Party I thought there'd be more resistance to him on the things that were worse about him, and more, even if they went along, daylight between him and the Republicans in Congress than there was. I didn't predict the extent to which they totally fell in line. I thought the Democratic Party would be worse in terms of, I thought more people like Sanders and AOC and so forth would capture more the kind of, the party would be more about those people than I think it's proven to be in the last 4 years. So in that sense, the Republicans have been worse than I thought. The Republicans a little bit better. But then if you told me the Democrats weren't going to rally behind an AOC-like figure, and this was before AOC was on the stage anyway, but some kind of socialist, nihilist, hard leftist figure, if you said, like, how is it going to happen that they don't? I would have thought, well, there'll be some charismatic centrist-y kind of guy who will rise up. Maybe it'll be Cory Booker or someone who will say, you know, I'm a pro-business, moderate, forward-thinking Democrat who's not like these people. But the fact that they couldn't find anybody to rally behind except a really, really old guy conveying the idea that this is the past of the Democratic Party we're still holding on to. We don't have a sense of who the future of that is. Maybe Harris will end up occupying that role and defining herself that way, but there's not too much sign yet about that. Is depressing. So the Democrats have been a little better than I feared they would be, but not in a way that gives me any kind of confidence or hope or confidence for the future. And of course, their central policy goals are ones I don't agree with. So it's, I don't know, maybe it's hard to see, from my perspective, short-term things to be optimistic about in politics, other than that I think we're off the very bumpy ride we've been on for the last several years that I don't think have been good for the country.
Yeah, I hope so. Although I think I now start looking forward to, okay, what does 2024 look like, right? Because the idea of Trump running in 2024 has been floated. And I'm not entirely convinced that Biden isn't a one-term president anyway. I mean, I think a lot of people, myself included, voted for him, not necessarily for him, but because he was not Donald Trump. And the reality is both of them are, you know, old as dirt already, and in 4 years they're going to be old as dirt plus 4 years, right? I think that's something to consider. And what does it look like for, you know, Trump, you know, Don Jr. or kind of one of these other folks that have been key in the Trump administration? I don't know that they have quite the charisma and bravado, with the exception of maybe Don Jr. But I think that's kind of where I start looking is what does 2024 look like? Because I agree with you, the Democrats, I don't know that I see a whole lot of kind of the heir apparents, Cory Booker, perhaps, and then there's a lot of kind of the younger crew that is, I think, much more left. And then on the right, I also don't see a ton of that. You've got, you know, guys like Ben Sass, who I think is relatively kind of moderate centrist, but holds, you know, a lot of the things of the traditional GOP. And so it'll be interesting to see kind of over the next several years, kind of who the newcomers are and who kind of become the next leaders of each party, really.
I agree. It's unclear. I mean, it's unclear that Biden will run again. That just given how old he is, you know, he might think one term's enough, and I've done it, and I'm not up for it, or he might run again and lose. So I don't think we know who the Democratic nominee will be in 2024. I think it's if Biden chooses not to run again. I think, you know, the obvious next in line is Harris at this point. And it's hard to imagine someone, you know, it might be an uncontested primary in that case, or it might be that it's contested. I don't know. So we'll have to see who the Democrat, it could be Biden running again. He could be in great shape in 4 years and could be even very popular. Who knows? And on the Republican side, I mean, the threat of Donald Trump running again, I suspect it won't happen, but I think they'll like say he will and then won't. But you know, you never know. He could, and if not him, I think he'll play a very large role in the process. Either one of his kids will run, or everyone will be courting him and so forth for his endorsement. So I find it hard to see how someone who's not sort of super Trumpy can win the Republican nomination in 4 years. And you know, I mean, I think we'll have to see how the years go. It's, you know, how unpopular George W. Bush is in the Republican Party now is surprising, given how popular he was during his presidency. And the kinds of things that Trump was able to say during the primaries that were in effect heresies against the Bush era Republican Party. And if someone had said them 4 years earlier, every Republican would have booed them out of the room. And yet Trump, you know, got all of them, is a sign of how fickle people can be. And maybe it'll be the case that in 4 or 6 years from now, Trump's seen as an embarrassment by people who like him now, or maybe he'll continue to have this way. I think it's hard to call. Samil, welcome. What's your thoughts on what's happened?
Yeah, sorry, I was a little late to this. I had to get off the office hours for a class, but happy to be here. Happy with the result as well.
So are you happy with the result just in that you preferred Biden to Trump? Or, I mean, it was a closer election than people thought. It seems to have either Republicans retain control of the Senate, or it's so close, that it's a tie Senate, it's the Democrats. I mean, it's not the strong swing towards the Democrats that a lot of people were expecting or hoping for. Where are you on that? I mean, so Carlos was saying he's happy with it as a kind of election that rejected some of what he saw as the worst features of Trump, who he was voting for as a lesser of two evils, without giving the Democrats everything they wanted. Others of those of us who were Biden voters, including me, I'm happy that the Democrats didn't get as much as they could have out of this, but we got rid of Trump. But I'm a little worried that we didn't get as resounding a condemnation of him as we might have from the voters. What are your thoughts on how it's panned out?
So my general takeaway was, I'll start by saying election night was a lot of fun for me. I think I'm somebody who likes studying elections and kind of that side of it, to some degree more than the policy side of it, in fact. And watching the returns come in and going county by county. Obviously, we didn't have good exit polls this year, very unreliable, but it was kind of fun to dive into the data and try to make sense of everything. But I think it was concerning. I think one of in terms of my general take on what I think of the results, I think as somebody who was, not of voting age the last time around, I think Trump is somebody who I think shaped a lot of kind of I think my views around Trump, shaped a lot of my views around politics sometimes. And I think he's somebody who has definitely energized me in a negative way. I think a lot of people, I think one of the big arguments for Biden in the primary was that, you don't need somebody to energize the base. Trump energizes the base. He energizes them out against him. So seeing him gone was a good result. As somebody who generally identifies as a liberal, I would say that it was kind of disappointing to not see the gains in the House. We lost seats in the House, and it was particularly interesting to see the demographic shifts that led to those losses. It wasn't a surge in working class white voters, going for the Republican Party. It was minority voters in a year where Democrats made made racism and racial equality a big portion of their platform. Yet, more minority voters voted for Republican than any time in recent history. So I found that particularly interesting. But in general, I would say I'm a little bit concerned as far as productivity. I think, if our political climate is indicative of anything, I think it's that Washington's not doing enough. I think one of the reasons that you had the rise of Trump was people were disappointed with Washington, disappointed with Congress. And with divided government, it looks like we're headed towards more gridlock. It's not over yet. I think there's runoffs in Georgia, but it looks like we're headed there.
Yeah, I mean, I actually found the minority, I mentioned this earlier before you came on, the minority results a positive thing, including that. So Trump gained with minorities and lost with white men. Right? I mean, I don't mean he lost
college-educated white men.
Right, college-educated white men. But I mean, they both lost. Those groups still stayed with who they were with last time, but the margins shifted. And I think that's good because I don't like. It should be possible for racial justice issues to be an issue in an election and in our politics without which party you're in favor of being determined by your skin color or your ancestry. It's not like it's obvious which policies are best for Black people or Hispanic people or people of Asian descent or whatever, such that if you're Black, you ain't Black if you're not voting for Biden. Like there can't be a Black guy who looks at these things and says, You know, there's good things and bad things about both of them, but I think I'm better off with the other guy. And likewise, a white person too. So it's always really bothers me when it's assumed that there's only one view of how to deal with race issues, and it's the view that's favored by one party or the other. So I'd like to see both parties competing with one another over the black vote, over the Hispanic vote, over the white vote, over the vote of people who are concerned, not just who are in each of these demographics, but are concerned about the issues people in each of these demographics are concerned about. So like if there's a problem with policing, we have two ideas about how to fix it, and people are fighting over them rather than assuming anyone who's concerned about policing will be in the Democratic column. And so that was something I was pleased with, but then I don't consider myself a progressive or a liberal, except in the classical sense of the word liberal, where it means pro-freedom, but not in the sense of liberal versus conservative. I don't know, Chris, what do you think about I mean, both Carlos and I were saying we like gridlock, we like when the government's not doing too much. I think often because I think much of what it does is bad, and so it's better when it's hemmed in its ability to do it. But so in a way, that's a plus for me on this election. But there's a kind of thing I think it ought to be able to do well. It ought to be able to respond quickly in a crisis. If there's a need for special legislation to do with funding for what it's doing in the crisis or whatever, there ought to be able to people ought to be able to get together on that, hopefully across the aisle. And so that's the negative side of gridlock when there's paralysis. Are we in for gridlock paralysis, even on issues where there's consensus, or is there hope of a kind of gridlock that's a sign that the country can't decide which of two things it wants, so it does neither for a while? Open question. Another question. So we talked about all three of us who were here earlier in the call when Carlos was still on were agreeing that we thought the results of the election are pretty clear. And it's unlikely that the various challenges the administration or that Trump is making are going to have much effect long term. We think Biden will be sworn in January as per usual. What are your guys' thoughts though on the effect of Trump's not conceding on the transition? Is this just, is this something to really be worried about? Is it not? The transition will go fine anyway? What do you?
Yeah, I'd like to make a point here. I think, after 4 years of Trump, we've kind of become accustomed to, I think the right calls it Trump derangement syndrome, is that, liberals and Democrats and people who oppose him in a general sense are kind of panicky about everything that he does. But I think it's also important not to understate the impact of some of these actions. I just think it's pretty corrosive to democracy to, not accept the results of an election. I think one is that it can be a national security threat. I think there's some reporting, and I'm not entirely sure how true it is, that, the, I guess, slow and somewhat dragged on transition that took place between Clinton and Bush was something that Al-Qaeda had capitalized on, and that, we weren't able to respond quickly and effectively prior to the threat of Al-Qaeda prior to 9/11. So, it can pose a national security threat. Obviously, we also have a big pandemic and a recession going on. So I just think the country has needs that are more important than the president's ego, frankly. And I think the results are pretty clear. I just think it's pretty dangerous for the long-term health of our democracy to just say, it's not true, because I think there is such thing as objectivity. And I just don't understand it.
You don't understand it, or you don't agree with it?
I don't agree with it. I don't understand why he's doing it. I think it's just very, I've yet to hear an opinion from somebody, or I've yet to hear an explanation that isn't based around the idea that it's a very self-centered way to approach approach the outcome of an election.
But why is that not something you understand? I mean, I feel like it's what I expected him to do, and I feel like I understand it perfectly.
Yeah.
It's not, and I don't think.
I mean, maybe I think we're trying to understand something that's very understandable. I think we know.
But I don't think it's actually selfish, if by selfish one means what's actually in one's rational interest over time. But then I don't think any of what Trump does is that. So I think it's, how certain kind of emotion-driven, non-thoughtful people are. I mean, the issue, though, of what the effect is and of the derangements on one or the other political side here are, I mean, there are the two things. There's the worry about what this does to faith in the institutions generally, and to the ability to have peaceful elections in the future, and to the standing of the country in the world. And then there's the which is, in fact, kind of cultural effects of this. And then there are the simply, logistical effects of is there enough time to prepare for this? And this is the worry about a 2001 like scenario. I mean, my sense is that both how much it actually affected 9/11 is a harder to settle question than, something really bad happened not too long after that election. And I'm sure Bush, in retrospect, thought if we could have gotten more of a running start, it would have helped. Maybe it wouldn't have, but you would like to have every chance to prevent something like that. So I know the Bush administration was very concerned about making the transition to Obama as smooth as possible. And I think the Obama administration likewise with Trump. So not having that here signals to me a kind of sadly typical kind of this administration not prioritizing what's needed to help the country run, and not thinking about really the interests of the country. I mean, but then my view is that this administration's never been about the interests of the country or about the interests of the president. It's been about kind of neurotic obsession with one's own grievances, which is something I think political actors from all sides easily fall into. And it's been about chips on one shoulder. And
a couple of just kind of thoughts, and one question that I don't necessarily know the answer to. Does conceding, ignoring the political aspects of it, but does conceding, it doesn't do anything legally, right? Because it doesn't really matter until the December date when the results of the election are certified by the Electoral College, right?
Well, I mean, I think the conceding itself does nothing. But the current so the opposing candidate, right, the losing candidate, needn't have been the person who's currently president. So, like in the last election, if Hillary didn't concede, I don't think it would have done anything one way or the other. What would have mattered is whether Obama, the sitting president, recognized that his successor would be Clinton and would be Trump and not Clinton. And likewise in 2000, right? Gore wasn't the sitting president. Clinton was. It's that Clinton went along with Gore's not conceding more quickly than he did that created problems when he did. So the concession, I think, does nothing. But what matters for the transition is whether the current occupant of the Oval Office recognizes who the next occupant will be, and whether the various institutions in the whether they're given security briefings, whether there's coordination about what the current status of things is, and help to make the transition happen. And my sense is that some measures were put in place, although I don't know the details of this, after 2001 it wasn't just that Bush prioritized this and Obama did, but there was actual, I don't know if there was legislation or just executive policies set to kind of make the transition a more formal, institutionalized thing, and that's now being slowed by this.
And so that may be an opportunity for kind of what we were talking about earlier, which is, statutorily making some of these previous norms, the law, since apparently the norms don't mean anything to, some administrations. And, so maybe Congress is able to push something through that says, hey, regardless of, whether it's incumbent or not, starting 10 days after the general election, then, both candidates get security briefings, or, I don't know exactly what the mechanics of it would look like,
Right.
but
It
I
would
think
have
that
to
would
be a way
remove
that
some of this.
didn't depend on there being agreement as to who had won, because
Right. Because that's what creates the current problem, right? Is despite there, I think, being a very broad consensus over who won, the person that gets to, ultimately decide yay or nay, we're going to start, security briefings and access to information and personnel and budget and things like that, has said, well, no, I don't want to play ball. And then I had another thought, but I lost it. So I'll come back to it if I remember it.
Let me ask about the following claim that's been made. I mean, I think a sad thing that so much of our current politics is one party calling hypocrisy on the other party, because they can both be hypocrites and yet one of them's right this time. So, but nevertheless, McConnell and others, but particularly McConnell, made this point when being said, why are you indulging the president in this kind of stuff or whatever. Said, I don't want to hear anything about accepting the election or the verdict of this election from the party that spent the last 4 years, I forget if they're trying to undo or override or, contesting in effect the previous election. What does one make of that? Is there anything to McConnell's point where the Democrats there were claims from Hillary Clinton about various improprieties. There was the investigation into Russian interference in the previous election, what Republicans call the Russia hoax now. Is there any kind of legitimate parallelism in the two cases?
I think he's right to an extent, but I also think that what he's saying in that Democrats were not accepting the results of the election, or that Democrats were trying to override it. I don't think that part's entirely true. I think ultimately Democrats had accepted what had happened. They were just grieving over it, I guess. And I think they're trying to figure out why it happened and if that why included any malfeasance. But I think it was pretty clear. I mean, there was that clip of, Joe Biden was certifying the Electoral College results back in 2016. And, there's a Democratic congresswoman who's, making a case, and Joe Biden says, it's over. This thing has been over. Hillary Clinton conceded the election the next morning. And I do think what the Democrats did in 2016 is not, I think, equivalent to what the Republicans are doing right now.
Yeah, I generally concur, because despite the, I think the pushback from the Democratic Party over the last 4 years, they ultimately were not the ones that started the Mueller investigation. And even, I think, had the Mueller investigation said, yes, the Trump campaign directly colluded with Russia and et cetera, it would not have suddenly made Hillary Clinton president. I'm not a constitutional law scholar, but I don't think that's how it works, right? And I don't think that I saw any of the Democratic legislators not recognizing Donald Trump as the president of the United States. And so I think that's where the difference is in the current time period, as brief as it might be, the Republican Party is, not accepting the results of the election, and that's fine. That's their right to do. But I don't view them as equivalent. I don't haven't seen any evidence over the last 4 years that the Democrats don't recognize that Donald Trump is the president of the United States.
Yeah, I think this is a bad faith claim. This kind of McConnell argument. I mean, first of all, you can't associate everybody in the party together and they're all acting exactly the same way. Hillary Clinton came out the next day and conceded the election, and Barack Obama, immediately started allowing for the transition to occur and met with Trump and so forth. Someone who we really hated, right? So and campaigned hard against. So if there were a lot of Democratic protesters saying "not my president, not my president," that's a different thing from the people who are actually the heads of the party acting as though the person isn't the president or isn't the president elect. And then the idea that the Russia investigation was any kind of trying to overturn, or the impeachment was any kind of attempt to overturn the previous election, I find really a kind of anti-American way of thinking. I mean, impeachment, even if ill-intentioned and drummed up and hoaxes, wouldn't overturn the previous election. Mike Pence would have become the president, which is hardly what anyone in the Democrats, it's not like Hillary Clinton is waiting there in the wings, right? So the worst thing you can say about it, legitimately, even if all the worst claims were true, it's not about overturning the next election. It's about getting rid of a president that they especially hate, maybe they unfairly are targeting or something. But the bigger issue is there was clearly a crime, and by everyone's account, a crime committed in 2000 that was important. There was a hacking of one of the political parties. That's what ultimately, it's a digital version of what the Watergate scandal was about, right? And even if Trump was in no way involved, right, it's something that really required serious investigation. And it was right that everybody was investigating it. And you could have had a situation where both parties were on board with investigate this as fully as possible, and we want full transparency, and we disagree about what will be the outcome of it. But this really needs to be investigated. And that isn't, I think, in the end what we had, or at least isn't what we had with respect to the president. Of course, the people doing the investigation, Mueller, the Rosenstein, and so forth, were in fact all Republicans. But we had a kind of demonization and politicization of this investigation. I think both sides contributed to that, but primarily I think it's the president's demonizing it that caused it. It was something that had to be investigated, even if he was totally innocent, to figure out who was guilty and what should be done about it. And we can debate about what the results actually showed, but that it was understood as the president versus this investigation, and that this is primarily an investigation into him, is a real failing, when it could have and should have been understood as an investigation into a crime that's being siloed off from the president because of concerns people had that the crime benefited him, and we want to make sure that there's no actual or appearance or worry about the president interfering in the investigation for that reason. And it seems to me like it benefited him more than anybody else that it be investigated that way, insofar as he was innocent. And the evidence we have isn't exactly that he was innocent, but that the worst claims made were certainly not true, or there's not evidence of them. There was collusion, is a vague term that doesn't mean anything. There wasn't criminal conspiracy, but there was, some kind of interaction that one might worry about.
Right, but that's just the Trump MO, right? Is he made it personal, even though it was not personal, right? It was, the original investigation was, did Russia interfere in our election, and did they, try and help the Trump campaign? And he took that as, well, I couldn't win on my own, therefore that's completely bogus. And he made it this personal thing. And I think for the good of American democracy, everybody should want claims like that, investigated, because we don't want foreign interference in our elections. And as much as it would, I wouldn't care for it if it was my candidate, if they won through, some foreign government interference, especially a hostile government. I wouldn't want them to win that way. I would want them to win in an above board manner. But that's just the Trump kind of pride, narcissism of it's all about him and taking it very personally, right?
Yeah, I wouldn't say pride, because I think pride, you should take pride in what you do. And I have a positive view of pride, and this isn't a prideful, it's a narcissistic action. But it's one of the things I really hold against Trump. I mean, I was very opposed to Trump in the previous election, but his election night speech, I thought, he did what he ought to have done to pivot towards being the president from being a pugilist in this thing. And I was hopeful that, although I was sure he was going to do a lot of things I didn't like, and there was a lot about him personally that I thought his character is really bad, maybe he'll, be the best president he can be. And I was trying to give him, and his stance on this is one of the things that made it clear from early on that he wasn't going to rise to the occasion. In my mind. On the other hand, but to not give the other party a pass on this, I really don't. I'm troubled by the referring to all of these things as election interference. It seems to me that they're two different things. So election interference, it packages together, campaigning on behalf of one side, doing crimes that expose dirt on one side, which is what happened in the case of Russia, right? And what Watergate was, although it wasn't a foreign country involved in it, and actually interfering with the votes. So if you, if the Russians or the Iranians or the Chinese or whatever, came and hacked the voting systems, or if they, hacked traffic lights in some way that made it like very, very hard to get to polling places in Detroit, and therefore Detroit's vote was down, or, something like that. That's, I think, a very different matter than if they attempt to make Biden or Hillary Clinton or somebody look bad, whether they do it through legal or illegal means. Like even if they just slandered them, or I think voter election interference, in quotes, that goes through the route of trying to get the voters to favor one candidate or another through moral or immoral, legal or illegal means, I think is a different kind of thing than interference in the process of the vote. And I don't like that we have a term that encompasses both of them. I think they're quite different crimes. And I think we ought to have, I think it's a problem that election interference was used to describe what Russia did in the previous election. And it's one that makes it a lot easier to assimilate Trump's claims about what happened this time with voter fraud to the claims, not in the claims, the facts of what we know happened last time with respect to Russian influence.
And so what terminology would you use? Because I don't know that I view them as kind of different as you do. One is just one is more of a physical interference, right? Preventing people from voting or changing their vote, whereas the other is more of a psychological method of changing their vote, perhaps, based on Twitter bots and Facebook or, whatever it is. And so I don't know that I draw quite the same distinction that you do. But
only the one that's interfering in the election itself, in the process of the voting, is interfering in the election. The other is an influence campaign or a smear campaign or what's supposed to happen in an election is people are supposed to make up their minds about who's better. And then once they've made up their minds about who's better, we're supposed to have a kind of process by which everybody could say what they've decided, and then we tally that all up and to get the result. And that thing, everybody putting in their chit and it being decided, that's the election, not the process over the past year of everyone making up their mind. That's not the election, that's life. And so I don't think anything that was done then is election interference. It's influence campaigns, it's propaganda campaigns. And what we often have is propaganda campaigns of various sorts. And what we had in the case of the 2000 election was a propaganda campaign assisted by a criminal hacking by a foreign power. And it's not clear to me that the propaganda campaign ought to be illegal. Maybe it should be, maybe it shouldn't. I don't know what the details of it are and if there was any kind of misrepresentation in violation of terms of service with social media companies or whatever. But it's certainly a concerning thing we want to know about. There's a propaganda campaign. But the thing that was definitely a criminal act was a hacking perpetrated by a foreign government to facilitate a propaganda campaign. And that is, I think, what we should have been, that's what I think the investigation was really into, not into election interference.
That's fair. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Samil.
The more you think of it that way, the more you could imagine the Republican candidate getting on board with the investigation. The election was fine. People preferred me. However, the Democrats did a crummy job with their server, and these criminals from Russia, exploited that. And, of course, we Republicans are better. Our servers are kept secure. One more reason to vote for us next time. But one thing we got to do now that we're president is make sure nobody, exploits weak people who are dumb about server security in this way again, and so forth. And you can imagine rhetoric where you're like powerful on prosecuting this charge, and you're not interpreting it as a thing. And you can imagine the Democrats arguing back, no, Trump wouldn't have won without this. But that having been separated from there's a crime here that needs investigation.
And I can see how it would be politically beneficial too, is to say, like and for the sake of transparency, for an administration to say, we want this investigated. So I totally see your point there.
And so I would have liked to, anyway. But I think I never heard election interference used this way until 2000, where and I thought it was a bad expansion of our vocabulary. Maybe it was already used that way in international relations. I don't know. Look, I don't think of the Watergate thing as election interference. That's not the problem. I don't remember it being described that way. The Nixon and Creep and all these people interfered in the 72 election. The issue was they broke into someone's thing under the direction of the president. Then that that's a crime, and it's a particularly bad crime because it has implications to do with the election. But it's not. The crime is breaking and entering and conspiracy and criminal conspiracy and cover up and so forth.
Can I make a point, Greg, before we go? Because I think that the conversation around this topic is going to fade a little bit because it wasn't like the last election. But after this election, it looks like Wisconsin 0.6, Georgia 0.3, Arizona 0.3. Those are the Wisconsin being the tipping point state. This was a much closer election in the Electoral College than it was in the national popular vote.
Mm-hmm. That was true last time also.
Right. And so this time it looks like the difference between the national popular vote and the tipping point state will be about 4.4. Last time around it was 2.9. So that gap is widening. Does this election challenge or reinforce any of your prior beliefs on the Electoral College?
Chris, what do you think?
Not really. I go back and forth on the Electoral College. I'm not sure if it's good or it's not good. I think the pros of it are that small states get that you don't disproportionately kind of adversely affect rural voters, right? I think the cons are kind of the flip side of that, right? So I'm from Wyoming, which has a population of about 500,000 people. And so on a kind of electoral votes per capita basis, my vote carries a lot more weight in Wyoming than it does in Texas. However, both of them generally kind of go the same way, and so ultimately, maybe it doesn't matter. I think the other kind of like criticism of it is kind of the common, if a state goes 52-48, well, then only the 52% actually get represented. And so I don't know. I go back and forth on whether or not I think it's a useful institution or not. And so to directly answer your question, no, I don't think it's changed my view, because I don't know that I necessarily had a view to begin with.
Okay.
Yeah, it hasn't changed my view. I mean, I always knew that if Trump won this election, it would be by winning the Electoral College and not the popular vote, and that if he lost it, he would come closer in the Electoral College than he would in the popular vote. So it's I don't think the particular way it panned out this time has much of an influence. I'm also somewhat ambivalent on the Electoral College. I mean, if I were designing a country from scratch, I don't think I'd have it exactly like our Electoral College is now, but I also don't think I'd have it. I'm not convinced they'd have it popular election elects the president. And if I could just retweak things now, I think, if I was somehow had my own constitutional convention or something happening now, I think probably for the present United States, I'd favor something that keeps some of the weighting that the Electoral College gives to distribute things across states, but not to the extent that it does. So it's something like a Wyoming, or I think it is actually Wyoming that has the most clout per voter. I think it's something like 78 times now how powerful a Wyoming vote is compared to a California vote, or whichever vote is least. Whereas if we went back to the original 13 colonies, it was something like, I don't know, 13 or 15 times more. The least the state most favored to the state that was least. So I think I would incline towards doing something that gives some kind of skewing, so that you can't have campaigning that happens in just one part of the country to the exclusion of the other, but less so, because I think what you have now is campaigning that happens in just a few parts of the country to the exclusion of the rest, because these swing states that are made swing states in part by their electoral vote situation become then the only important states. And so you don't get that much campaigning in New York or California, and you also don't get that much campaigning in Massachusetts. Those are all, or in Utah or Texas, more in Texas than usual, because people thought it might flip this time. So I don't know, insofar as I think there's a need to weight against concentrations in the urban areas, I think the current Electoral College isn't doing it in the ideal way. And I think it's becoming a problem that it isn't. But I don't think just eliminating it overnight is the best thing. And then there's the other issue of, we have some counterweighting just in the existence of a Senate in the government as a whole. So it's not clear to me how important it is that you also have a counterweighting in the president, and part of that has to do with how the powers are distributed. So I'm pretty ambivalent on Electoral College issues. The other thing that I think about this whole kind of set of issues, like the Electoral College, what if we made Puerto Rico and DC states, and what about this and what about that, is I don't think any of these things have exactly the kind of effects people often imagine they will, on both parties imagine they will. Both parties think things like that, and letting more immigrants in and giving more immigrants the vote would favor the Democrats. But I don't think that's really true. I think what happens is the nature of our political system is such that the parties have to be roughly equal in likelihood to win control of the national government, and that if they're not, the positions of the parties will rejigger such that they become roughly equal to win. So it's not as though if we did something that made the Democrats 50%, guaranteed to win every election from now on until there was some other change, that all the Democrats' priorities would get through. For a year or two, some of more of their priorities would get through, and then the whole coalitions would shift, and you'd have another dispute over different issues about which there'd be a stalemate. And there's no way of telling whether that dispute is overall closer to the left or the right from where it is now. Because the left and the right aren't coherent ideologies. They're just kind of factions that have gotten together. And so, I think if you made it the case that the Republicans could never win a national election, the parties would then, because of the demographic shift or whatever, the parties would then change what they were on about. And I have no idea in the new world, whether abortion would be more or less likely to be legal, and whether taxes would be higher or lower, or whether whatever. And likewise, if only Republicans could win elections because of something that made the cities count even less or whatever. So I think it's just hard to predict these things. I mean, you'd think having more and more Hispanics voting was supposed to help the Democrats, right? And yet it's the Hispanic supposed to, in that's what Democrats thought, and it's what Republicans thought who were afraid of it. And yet Hispanic voters in Florida and in Texas really swung towards Trump in ways that people didn't anticipate. And to the Trump team's credit, that they were out, vying for those voters. So I think you can't, it's too clever by half to think you can predict what's going to happen in those scenarios. So I think just there's something I think unfair about some people's votes counting in terms of national politics, orders of, so many times more than others. And on that ground, I'd like to see that changed a bit, but I don't have very much confidence about who that would favor. I think if it changed enough, the parties would shift in what they stood for, and no one knows what it would favor.
Yeah, two more quick thoughts on that that you reminded me of. One is, yes, Wyoming on a per capita basis has, the strongest vote, but ultimately they don't, because absent some major demographic shift, all three of Wyoming's electoral votes will go to Republican presidents for the foreseeable future. And so in reality, living in a swing state, your vote is much more powerful in terms of affecting outcomes than on a per capita basis. And one of my big, to use your phrase, if I was, had my own constitutional convention, what I would do that I think would solve a lot of those issues is I would institute ranked choice voting over kind of this binary system. I think that would solve a number of issues with the Electoral College and kind of this lesser of two evils problem that many of us have found ourselves in over the last, 8 years.
We have it now in Maine, right, for the not for the presidential election, but for the senatorial election. So maybe there'll be, I don't know how long it's been in Maine. It's pretty recent. Maybe we'll get
and House.
What?
And House elections. Jared Golden won in Maine on the back of ranked choice voting. His opponent was leading, and after ranked choice votes were counted, he won.
Huh. So we will we'll get to see what Maine's experience is like, and maybe that'll be a case for or against having it in more places. It's hard to know though, because when you say he won on the back of ranked choice voting, would all the people who voted for someone else's number one have voted for him otherwise? I don't know. Because let's say you think, whatever. I most like, who's the third most likely? The Libertarian candidate. I most like the Libertarian candidate, but she'll never win. And between Trump and Biden, I like Trump more, let's say. And so I vote, Jorgensen, Trump as my vote. And then, Jorgensen doesn't win, so then my vote goes over to Trump. You might think, well, then Trump won on the back of ranked choice voting. Alternately, you might think there's no way I would have voted for Jorgensen won in such a close election unless I knew that my vote would go over to Trump. So my expectation is that the effect of ranked choice voting would be that it would make people more comfortable voting for third-party candidates. That if it has propitious effects, it would be through that. All the people who say, I would have voted for the Libertarians or the Green Party or whatever, but they don't have a chance to win, we'll put them as number one now, and then we'll get to see how many people there really are like that. And if it turns out there are a lot of them, then it'll no longer be true that that party doesn't have a chance to win. And maybe that's a good thing. I don't know.
Or maybe they win because they're everybody's second choice, right? And there's no clear number one, and then we end up with our first Green Party president or something.
Yeah. Better that we wind up with our first person chosen by this as a representative or senator from Maine than for the president, and we see how well it works, and then other states can decide whether they want to go with this. All right. Well, we're at time for today. Thank you guys for joining us and for being a part of this discussion over the last few months. And I hope, well, since we don't all agree on what we're hoping for, but for each of your sake, I hope your best hopes come through for the next 4 years and not your worst fears. And we'll have hope to see you all again on future Salem Center programs of different sorts.